Empire of Blood. Episode 16. The Ledger and the Grave. Lord Curzon, Viceroy of British India. India, 1899 to 1905. The grain is still warm. That is the first thing you need to understand. This is not ancient history. This is not the distant past where we grant ourselves the comfort of uncertainty. The grain is warm because it was harvested days ago, in October 1899, in the province of Bengal, in the eastern reaches of the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. The grain is warm, it is plentiful, and it is moving, loaded onto rail cars, stacked in wooden crates, stamped with the seal of the East India Company's successor, the British Crown. It is moving away from the people who grew it. It is moving toward a port, and behind it, in the village it has just left, children are beginning to die. The village does not have a name in the historical record. Very few of the villages where people died in this famine have names in the historical record. The historical record was kept by the British administration, which tracked grain movements with exacting precision and tracked mortality with considerably less rigor, because grain movements were revenue, and revenue was the point, while deaths were, in the administrative accounting of empire, a kind of rounding error. The village is a village in Bengal in 1899, and for our purposes, that is enough. You can imagine a village in October. You can imagine the heat which lingers in Bengal long into autumn, and the dust on the roads, and the sound of the few surviving cattle. For in the way the air near a colonial grain warehouse smells of rice and damp wood, and the rust of the corrugated iron roof. You can imagine the silence, which is the worst thing. Famines are not loud. The depictions of famine that most people carry in their imaginations, the wailing crowds, the desperate mobs, are partially true, and are partially a projection of what we expect suffering to look like. But the deeper reality of famine, the reality that everyone who has studied or witnessed it comes back to, is silence. The silence of bodies that no longer have the energy to make noise. The silence of communities that have been reduced below the threshold of social functioning, where even the acts of communal mourning require energy that nobody has. The silence of children who have stopped crying because crying is a metabolic expense, and their bodies have made the calculation. That silence is what Saraswati walks through every morning to get water. Her name was Saraswati. She was 31 years old, though she looked 50. 2 harvests of failed rains had already stripped the flesh from her arms, already turned her husband's cough into something worse, already taken 2 of her 4 children. She did not know the word famine. She knew the feeling of it, a specific kind of panic that has no English equivalent. The panic of understanding that the thing keeping you alive has simply stopped being available, not because of violence, not because of war, but because of a decision made somewhere else, by someone who would never see your face. She could see the grain store from her doorway. It sat 40 yards away, a squat colonial warehouse with a corrugated iron roof. They padlocked, guarded by 2 sepoys who had been told not to deviate from their instructions under any circumstances. The instructions had come from the district collector, who had received them from the provincial governor, who had received them from the Viceroy's office in Calcutta. The chain of authority was intact, clean, functioning exactly as designed. The grain would be sold at market price, and only at market price, because the Viceroy believed, with the certainty of a man who had studied political economy at Oxford, that to give grain away was to distort the natural function of commerce, that to offer relief below market rates was to invite dependency, that to interrupt the flow of trade, even in a famine, was to do more harm than good in the long run. The long run. Saraswati was not living in the long run. She was living in October 1899, and her youngest child had not eaten in 3 days. She walked to the warehouse. She asked. In her own language, then in the broken English she had learned from the mission school 20 years ago, she asked. The sepoys looked at her without cruelty. This is important to understand. They were not cruel men. They were following a procedure. And they told her the price. The price was set. The price had not changed. The price was for a woman whose husband could no longer work and whose last coin had been spent 2 weeks ago, a number so abstract it might as well have been the distance to the moon. She walked home. Her child died 4 days later, 400 miles to the northwest, in the marble-floored Viceroy's house in Calcutta. A man named George Nathaniel Curzon, first Marquis Curzon of Kedleston, Baron Curzon, Viceroy and Governor-General of India, was writing a letter. It was a letter to the Secretary of State for India in London. In it, he described the famine situation in Bengal and the northwest provinces as under control. He noted that relief camps had been established. He noted that the administration was functioning with admirable efficiency. He noted that the cost of relief must not, under any circumstances, be allowed to exceed the revenue projections set by his office. He sealed the letter. He handed it to an aide. He returned to his desk. That is where the story begins. Not in the village. Not with Saraswati. The village is where the story ends, or rather, where it ends for the people who die in it, which turns out to be somewhere between 1 and 2 million human beings over the next several years. The story begins at the desk. It begins with the man sitting behind it, the educated, brilliant, meticulously organized man who looked at the mechanisms of one of history's most sophisticated administrative systems and saw, above all, a machine to be perfected. His name is George Curzon, and by the time he's done perfecting his machine, the ground beneath it will be full of bones. Think about what it means to be capable of that and not know it. Not in the way that monsters know it. Not with malice or fury or any of the emotions we reach for when we try to explain mass death. George Curzon never thought of himself as a man who was killing anyone. He thought of himself as a man who was governing. He thought of himself as a servant of civilization itself, doing the hard and necessary work that the small-minded and the sentimental were too weak to do. He believed this. That is the most terrifying sentence in this entire story. He believed this. Stay with that for a moment, because everything that follows, the policy decisions, the bureaucratic machinery, the locked warehouses, the bodies in the fields, everything flows from that belief. And if you want to understand how empires kill, you have to understand that the most efficient instruments of mass death are rarely the ones who hate. They are the ones who are absolutely, serenely, unshakably certain that they are right. There were, in October 1899, approximately 300 million people living under the authority of the British Crown in India. 300 million. That number has to be held carefully, because numbers at that scale don't behave like human quantities anymore. They become geological, abstract, like speaking of mountains by their height in millimeters. So let us hold a smaller number for a moment. In the Bengal district of Bankura, in that same October, there were 12 villages within a single administrative block that would collectively lose, by the following summer, somewhere between 8 and 12% of their population to famine and the diseases that ride in its wake. Not 12% of an abstraction. 12% of people who woke up that morning with the specific weight of their own hunger, the specific sound of their children crying in the dark before dawn, the specific fear that is not fear in the abstract, but the fear of a person who can see exactly how it ends and has no way to stop it. We talk about famines in statistics. We have to. The individual stories are almost unbearable to carry. and there are millions of them. But the statistics have a way of becoming a kind of insulation. 2 million dead becomes a quantity, a data point, a number to place in a historical argument. So before we move into the history, before we trace the empire and the man and the machine, I want you to hold the individual story. Saraswati, her child, the grain behind the iron roof, the price that was set somewhere else, the death that came 4 days later in a country that had the capacity to prevent it and chose, with the meticulous logic of empire, not to. To understand what George Curzon inherited, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the very beginning, not to the first English ships that nudged into Indian harbors in 1608, though that story matters too. You have to go back to 1857. You have to go to the thing that Britons called the Sepoy Mutiny, and Indians called the First War of Independence, and you have to sit with what that event did to the psychology of an entire empire. The British East India Company had been running the subcontinent for the better part of 2 centuries by the time it began to collapse. It was a remarkable arrangement, one of the strangest and most consequential corporate experiments in human history. A trading company that had slowly, almost accidentally, accumulated an army, a judiciary, a revenue apparatus, and effective sovereignty over a landmass that dwarfed the British Isles many times over. At its height, the company governed roughly 250 million people, and it did so with a staff of a few thousand Britons and a borrowed army of Indian soldiers called sepoys, who made up the vast majority of the fighting force. For decades, this worked. It worked because the company was, in its way, flexible. It worked because local rulers were co-opted rather than abolished, because existing revenue structures were absorbed rather than replaced, because the whole system maintained a kind of pragmatic slipperiness that kept it from snapping under pressure. It was not a system built on love, it was built on transaction, and for a long time, that was enough. Then came the cartridges. The specific cause of the 1857 uprising, the thing that lit the powder keg, was a rumor. A rumor that the new Enfield rifles being issued to sepoy regiments were lubricated with animal fat. Beef tallow, which would be sacrilege for Hindu soldiers. Pork lard, which would be sacrilege for Muslim soldiers. Whether the rumor was true or partly true or entirely false is, in some ways, beside the point. The point is that it ignited something that had been building for decades, a fury at cultural humiliation, economic displacement, the grinding arrogance of a foreign administration that had spent 200 years making very clear that Indian civilization was inferior. Indian religion was superstition, and Indian people were, at best, children in need of civilizing. The uprising spread across northern and central India with a speed and violence that genuinely terrified the British. Cities fell. Officers were killed. Their families, women and children, were killed. At Cawnpore, a massacre of British women and children became, in the British imperial imagination, the defining atrocity of the 19th century, invoked for decades afterward whenever the question arose of how firmly India needed to be controlled. The British response was correspondingly savage. Rebels were blown from cannon mouths. Villages were burned. Summary executions were carried out in numbers that dwarfed the original violence. Estimates of total deaths across the uprising and suppression run to hundreds of thousands. When it was over, the company was dissolved. The British Crown took direct control of India. Queen Victoria became eventually Empress of India, and the entire apparatus of colonial administration was rebuilt from the foundations up, this time with no pretense of flexibility. This time with the explicit lesson drawn that India required not accommodation, but domination. Not partnership, but control. Not the messy pragmatism of the old company regime, but a rationalized, centralized, hierarchically perfect machine of governance. This is the machine that George Curzon inherited. By 1899, when Curzon arrived in Calcutta to take up his position as Viceroy, the British Raj had achieved something that, from the outside, looked almost miraculous. It had constructed, across a subcontinent of dizzying diversity, hundreds of languages, dozens of major religions, thousands of ethnic communities, climates ranging from Himalayan peaks to tropical coasts, a single unified administrative structure. The Indian Civil Service, the ICS, was one of the most selective and prestigious bureaucracies in the world. Its members were drawn from Oxford and Cambridge, and tested in competitive examinations that emphasized classical learning, mathematics, and a particular kind of crystalline analytical intelligence. They were, by almost every conventional measure, extraordinarily capable men. They were also, by design, almost entirely British. This was not an accident. After 1857, the fear of another uprising had hardened into a policy of deliberate exclusion. Indians could serve in subordinate positions, as clerks, as translators, as low-level administrators. But the decision-making tier, the level at which policy was made and enforced, was reserved for men who had been educated in Britain, socialized in Britain, and who carried in their heads a set of assumptions about the natural order of things that made the whole enterprise seem not just acceptable, but virtuous. And the assumptions went something like this. The British Empire was the highest expression of civilized governance yet achieved by humanity. Its expansion was not conquest, it was uplift. The Indian people, brilliant in many ways, the British would acknowledge, possessed of ancient and sophisticated cultures, were nonetheless, by virtue of history, climate, and some set of characteristics that the Victorians could never quite define without embarrassing themselves, not yet ready for self-governance. The Raj existed to prepare them, to modernize them, to bring them, however reluctantly, into the light of rational administration and scientific progress. This belief system had a name. They called it the Civilizing Mission. And it is important to understand that it was not a cynical mask worn over naked greed, and though greed was certainly part of the picture. Many of the men who administered the Raj believed it sincerely. They believed they were doing good. They believed the suffering they caused was regrettable but inevitable, the price of a necessary transformation. They looked at India's famines, which occurred with terrible regularity throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and they saw not a system generating death, but a nature generating death, and their job as administrators was to manage nature's cruelty with the tools of civilization. The tools of civilization were, primarily, railways and ledger books. The railways were genuinely impressive. By the time Curzon arrived, India had over 25,000 miles of track, more than any country in Asia, more than most countries in Europe. The railways moved people, moved mail, moved troops, moved information, with a speed that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. They also moved grain. This is a fact that will become important. The railways made it easier to move food away from the places that produced it and toward the cities and ports where it could be sold. They made India's agricultural surplus available to global markets in a way that had never been possible before. They also made it possible, in theory, to move relief food toward famine areas. In theory. The ledger books were, if anything, more central to how the Raj understood itself. Revenue collection was the heart of the whole enterprise. The land tax, the assessment of every agricultural holding in India, the calculation of what it owed the Crown, was the foundational activity of British administration, and teams of surveyors and revenue officers had spent decades mapping, measuring, and taxing the subcontinent. The Bengal Permanent Settlement of 1793 had locked in a system of land taxation that transferred enormous amounts of agricultural surplus from peasant farmers to landlords who were required to pay fixed sums to the Crown. The Punjab Land Revenue Act, the Bombay Revenue Code, the whole architecture of British fiscal management in India was built on the extraction of revenue from agriculture year after year, regardless of whether the rains had come. Regardless of whether the rains had come. Sit with that for a moment. In a country where agriculture was almost entirely dependent on monsoon rainfall, where a failed monsoon could mean the difference between a harvest and a catastrophe, as the British had built a taxation system that treated the land's productivity as a fixed and dependable quantity. Not because they didn't know monsoons failed. They knew. There were records going back centuries showing the regular, devastating cycle of drought and famine across the Indian subcontinent. They knew, and they built their revenue system anyway, because the revenue had to flow. The empire cost money to run. The Indian taxpayer, the Indian peasant farmer, was the primary source of that money. This is the context. This is the ground into which George Curzon steps in January 1899. He steps into an empire that is, by its own accounting, a magnificent success. An empire of railways and telegraph lines and well-maintained roads and a civil service of extraordinary efficiency. An empire that has, in less than a century, transformed the governance of a quarter of humanity. An empire that is also, and this is the part that never appears in the official accounting, an engine for transferring wealth from one of the world's most productive agricultural regions to a small island off the northwest coast of Europe. The numbers are stark. In the decades between 1875 and 1900, India experienced 12 major famines, far more than in the preceding century and a half. The total estimated death toll from those famines is somewhere between 12 and 29 million people, a range so enormous that it should stop us cold, a range that exists because nobody thought it was important to count. The famines occurred against a backdrop of steadily increasing agricultural exports. And as more and more Indian grain moved through British-controlled ports to British-controlled markets, the local food supply for Indian peasants became thinner, more fragile, more vulnerable to the seasonal variations that had always existed, but had once been buffered by local storage, local markets, and the social networks that community-level governance provides. The Raj had dismantled those networks, not out of malice, out of efficiency. Out of the conviction that modern, rationalized, centralized administration was superior to the messy, local, community-based systems it replaced. And in this conviction, the Raj was not wrong about the efficiency. It was spectacularly wrong about what efficiency was for. Into this system, in this moment, arrives George Curzon, 40 years old, brilliant, energetic, deeply, almost violently ambitious, the most qualified viceroy in decades by most accounts, the most intellectually serious, the most administratively capable, and, it will turn out, one of the most catastrophically indifferent to human suffering that the empire has ever produced. Not because he wanted people to die, this cannot be emphasized enough, and we will return to it throughout this episode, because it is the thing that makes Curzon's story not just a historical atrocity, but a philosophical one. George Curzon did not want people to die. He wanted his administration to run. He wanted his empire to be great. He wanted to be remembered as one of the finest governors India had ever seen. And in the pursuit of those goals, He built and operated and refined a machine that killed people by the hundreds of thousands, and while he sat at his desk writing letters about the importance of administrative efficiency. But before we get to Curzon the man, we need to finish with the machine he was inheriting, because the machine predates him, and this matters enormously. Curzon did not arrive in Calcutta and invent the circumstances that would produce mass death. He arrived to find them already in operation, already refined over decades of colonial governance, already justified by a vast and sophisticated intellectual apparatus that made the catastrophic seem sensible to the people administering it. Consider the theory of revenue assessment. The British had, over the course of the 19th century, devised what they considered a model system for determining how much land tax each agricultural holding in India owed the Crown. It involved sending teams of trained assessors, generally called settlement officers, across every district in India to measure, map, and categorize each piece of cultivable land. These officers estimated the land's potential productivity, set a figure for what it should yield in a normal year, and then taxed a portion of that theoretical yield as the Crown's due. The word theoretical is doing heavy lifting in that sentence. A theoretical yield is what the land can produce when the rains come on schedule, when no disease hits the crops, when the farmer is healthy and has adequate labor and access to seed and has not already been financially ruined by last year's tax demand. The actual yield in any given year depended on conditions that no settlement officer had ever been able to predict or control. But the tax was assessed against the theory, not the reality. And the tax did not pause when the reality diverged from the theory. It was collected. In years when the rains failed, and across the vast agricultural areas of peninsular and northern India, rain failure was not a rare catastrophe, but a regular feature of the climate, occurring somewhere with statistical regularity every 3 to 5 years. The tax was still collected. If the farmer could not pay in cash, he could pay by selling assets, livestock, jewelry, the tools of his trade. If he had no assets left, he could borrow from the village moneylender at rates that could reach 60 or 70% per annum. If the debt grew too large to manage, he could sell the land itself. This is the treadmill. This is the mechanism by which, over decades of British rule, the Indian peasantry moved progressively closer to the edge. Not in one catastrophic leap, but in small steps, each one individually survivable, but the accumulation moving inexorably toward a point where there was no buffer left, no reserve, no social safety net of the kind that had existed in pre-British village economies when local rulers would sometimes forego revenue in bad years, and communal grain stores provided insurance against the worst monsoon failures. The British had, in their rationalization of Indian agriculture, dismantled these local systems in favor of the more efficient centralized revenue apparatus. They were not wrong that it was more efficient. They were catastrophically wrong about what was lost when local resilience was replaced with imperial accounting. By 1899, the cumulative effect of this process was visible in mortality statistics that the British themselves had collected. The death rate in India was rising, not falling, across the second half of the 19th century. This in a period when mortality was declining across most of the rest of the world. Life expectancy in British India was by the end of the century lower than it had been at the beginning. Famine deaths in the second half of the 19th century were, by conservative estimates, more than 10 times higher than in the first half. The Empire's great project of civilizing and modernizing the subcontinent was producing, in human biological terms, a population that was getting sicker and dying younger and experiencing catastrophic food crises with increasing frequency. These statistics existed, They were compiled by the Indian government's own statistical apparatus. They were available to anyone who chose to read them. Curzon read them and concluded that the problem required better administration. That is the empire. That is the stage. Now let us meet the man. George Nathaniel Curzon was born on January 11th, 1859, in a house that announced, from the moment you saw it, exactly what kind of world had produced him. Kedleston Hall stands in Derbyshire, in the middle of England, in the middle of the English countryside, which is to say in the middle of a particular version of the English countryside that exists primarily in the imaginations of people who have never had to work in it. It is a neoclassical mansion, marble floors, Doric columns, a central rotunda lit by a domed skylight, art collected over generations of comfortable wealth. It was designed in the 18th century as a statement, a very expensive statement, of the kind of family that lived there. A family that had been wealthy for generations, a family that had produced members of parliament, officers, clergy, men of distinction, a family that understood in its bones that certain people were born to govern and others to be governed, and that this arrangement was not merely convenient, but natural, divinely ordained, the organizing principle of civilized life. George Curzon was the firstborn son of this family, and he absorbed its assumptions along with its accent. He was, by every account, an unusual child. Precociously intelligent, voraciously curious, possessed of a memory so exceptional that his tutors found it slightly unsettling. He read everything. He remembered everything. He had opinions about everything, and he expressed them with a confidence that other children in other families might have had beaten out of them, but that in Curzon's case was encouraged, or at least not discouraged. He was being trained for something. Everyone around him knew it. The family's social position, the estate's visible splendor, the whole machinery of aristocratic English life was, in a sense, a preparation for a destiny that had not yet been named, but was already visible in the shape of the boy. There was also, alongside the intelligence and the confidence and the privilege, something else, something that his biographers tend to treat gently, but that deserves more direct examination. George Curzon, from his earliest years, was in pain. Not emotional pain, or not primarily. Physical pain. He suffered from a curvature of the spine, a condition that worsened through his adolescence and would torment him for the rest of his life. He wore, for decades, a leather brace beneath his clothing, a device that held him upright at the cost of constant low-grade suffering. He learned to disguise it. He learned to move with a deliberate, measured stiffness that other people read as aristocratic hauteur, the stiff back of a man who considered himself above the common hurry of life, when in fact it was the careful movement of a man who knew that a wrong step would send a blade of pain through his spine. This is worth knowing. It is not a medical footnote. The relationship between physical pain and personality is complex and poorly understood. But what we can say with some confidence is that living with constant pain tends to do one of two things to a person. It can produce empathy, an intimate understanding of suffering, a visceral knowledge that the body is fragile and that pain is real. Or it can produce something else, a kind of ferocious compartmentalization, a determination to prove that pain does not matter, that one is not limited by what the body does, that the mind and the will are supreme, that suffering is, in the final analysis, a personal failure. Curzon developed the second response. He was sent to Eton, as of course he was. Eton in the 1870s was the beating heart of the system that produced British imperial administrators, a place where the children of the ruling class were taught Latin and Greek and a very particular understanding of history, the understanding that civilization had always been built by great men doing hard things, and that the boys in these classrooms were the inheritors of that tradition. They would be Rome, they would be Britain, They would be the men who made the decisions, who drew the lines on the maps, who set the machines in motion. Curzon excelled. Of course he excelled. He had a mind designed for the environment, a memory built for the kind of learning being offered. But he also suffered something at Eton that, again, deserves more attention than it usually receives. He suffered under a housemaster named Oscar Browning, a man who alternated between favoritism and cruelty in ways that contemporary accounts suggest bordered on sadism. Browning had a particular talent for identifying the thing a boy most cared about and mocking it precisely there. And for Curzon, who cared intensely about his own intelligence and his own dignity, who had already constructed around himself an armor of aristocratic certainty, the mockery cut deep. A boy who is brilliant and knows it, who has been raised to believe that his qualities place him above others, who's then subjected to arbitrary humiliation by someone with power over him. That boy learns something specific. He learns that power is what protects you. Not virtue, not intelligence. Power. And he learns that the proper response to humiliation is not to show that it has landed. The proper response is to become the kind of person who cannot be humiliated because he controls the circumstances in which humiliation could occur. This is speculation, of course. Biographers should be careful with psychology. But it is the kind of speculation that holds up when you look at what Curzon became. He went from Eton to Oxford. At Oxford, he was brilliant, celebrated, socially triumphant in every way that Oxford could offer. He became president of the Oxford Union, the debating society that functioned as a training ground for future politicians. He wrote essays that dazzled his tutors. He formed friendships with men who would become the governing class of the British Empire. Arthur Balfour, Cecil Rhodes' various circle, the generation that would run everything in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. He was part of a group called the Souls, a social set of aristocratic intellectuals who considered themselves the most sophisticated people in England and were not entirely wrong. The Souls deserve a moment of their own, because they are part of the context that shaped the man who would go to India. They were not simply a social club. They were a collective identity built around the proposition that the upper-class world they inhabited was in need of intellectual refinement, that the Tory squirearchy and the hunting and shooting aristocracy that dominated country house England were too crude, too unreflective for the challenges of the modern age. The Souls read widely, they wrote poetry, they debated ethics and aesthetics. They took themselves seriously as thinkers as well as governors. Curzon was in this company, entirely at home. But there is something worth noting about intellectual culture at this level of English society, something that goes beyond the Souls and applies to the whole tradition from which they emerged. And the reading was wide, but the frame was narrow. The ethics being debated were the ethics of people with power. How to exercise power wisely, how to govern justly, how to be worthy of the positions to which birth and education had assigned you. The question of whether the positions themselves were legitimate, whether the whole structure of inherited privilege and imperial authority on which everyone in those conversations rested was justified. That question did not arise. It could not arise. Not seriously, not in a way that threatened the foundations. The intellectual sophistication was genuine and the range was real, but the foundation was a given. Empire was the given, hierarchy was the given, the civilizing mission was the given. Curzon absorbed these givens along with everything else that Oxford could provide, so he also failed his final examinations. This fact sits in his biography like a splinter. George Curzon, the most decorated intellectual of his generation at Oxford, received a second-class degree. For a man whose entire identity was built on the superiority of his mind, this was not merely disappointing. It was, on some level he never fully acknowledged, devastating. He had set out to get a first. He did not. And the man he became, meticulous, controlling, obsessively attentive to every detail of every project he undertook, constitutionally incapable of delegating because delegation implied that someone else might do it better. That man bears the shape of this failure, this single crack in the armor of his certainty. After Oxford came travel. This too is important. Curzon did not simply go to India as a viceroy, knowing nothing of Asia, that he traveled extensively across the entire sweep of the empire and its frontiers. Persia, Afghanistan, the countries of Central Asia, the places where the great game was being played between British India and Russian expansion. He traveled as a journalist, as an observer, as a man absorbing the world with the focused intensity of someone who intends, eventually, to run it. He wrote books, good books, by the standards of the time, careful and detailed accounts of what he saw. What he saw, traveling through Persia and Central Asia and the edges of India, was a world that needed managing, a world of, as he perceived it, brilliant ancient cultures that had nonetheless failed to develop the rational, systematic governance that the modern world required. He was not contemptuous, exactly. He admired. He was, in his way, one of the more genuinely learned British imperialists. He knew more about Persian architecture and Central Asian history than almost anyone in the British government, but his admiration was the admiration of a collector, a connoisseur. He could appreciate the beauty of a Persian mosque, while simultaneously believing that Persia needed Britain to come and sort out its governance. These positions did not, to him, contradict each other. He entered Parliament in 1886 as the member for Southport and began what would be an extraordinarily rapid ascent through the colonial administration. Parliamentary Under-Secretary for India in 1891. Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs in 1895. In between, more travel, more books, more speeches that established him as the foremost expert on Asian affairs in the British political world. By the time Lord Salisbury appointed him Viceroy in 1898, there was, if you squinted right, an inevitability to it. This was what Curzon had been for. This was the machine he had been designed to run. He was 39 years old when he arrived in Calcutta. He had, in the 39 years prior, never governed anything larger than a parliamentary constituency. He had never, so far as the record shows, spent significant time with people who were not wealthy, educated, and British. He had never sat with hunger. He had never watched a crop fail. He had never had occasion to understand what poverty looked like from the inside, what it did to the body and the mind and the soul, what it meant to have no recourse, no appeal, no mechanism for making the people with power over you aware of what you were experiencing. So he arrived in Calcutta with a spine brace and a certainty that together constituted his entire equipment for governing the most complex human situation on earth. His first years were, by the measures available to him, a remarkable success. He worked with superhuman energy. He was in his office at 7 in the morning and regularly there past midnight. He read every document that passed through his administration. And we're talking about a Raj that generated documents the way a monsoon generates water. And he annotated them, corrected them, sent them back with detailed instructions that were, by all accounts, technically brilliant. He reformed the police. He created the Northwest Frontier Province as a distinct administrative unit, simplifying governance in an area of constant tribal tension. And he oversaw the preservation of historical monuments across India, including the Taj Mahal, which had deteriorated severely under previous administrations. He organized the Delhi Durbar of 1903, a spectacular imperial pageant that assembled the princes and governors of the entire subcontinent to celebrate the accession of Edward VII, and he did it with a logistical precision that left everyone who witnessed it breathless. He was, in short, very good at the things he was trying to be good at. And this is the knife's edge on which Curzon's story balances. Because the things he was trying to be good at were not the things that most needed doing. The problems the Raj faced in 1899 were not, primarily, problems of administrative efficiency or historical preservation or spectacular pageantry. The problems were hunger, poverty, disease, and the structural relationship between the empire's economic demands and the people's ability to survive them, and on these problems, the problems that killed people, Curzon's brilliance was not only useless, it was actively harmful. The famine of 1899 to 1900 is now called the Indian Famine of 1899. It is not one of the more famous famines in the historical literature, which is itself a kind of verdict. Even catastrophes can be forgotten if they are not convenient to remember. But at the time, it was vast. The monsoon failed across much of central and western India. Crops failed across an area containing tens of millions of people. The famine spread from the central provinces into Rajputana, Bombay, the Punjab, and eventually into Bengal and the northwest provinces. At its height, the disaster touched something like 60 million people. Curzon's response was shaped by a document called the Famine Code. The Famine Code had been developed after the catastrophic famines of the 1870s, which had themselves killed millions and generated enough political pressure in Britain that Parliament had demanded a systematic response. The code laid out in precise detail the stages of famine, the criteria for declaring a famine, the types of relief that should be provided, the administrative procedures to be followed at each stage. It was, in its way, a remarkable document. It was evidence that the British knew what famines were, knew they would recur, and had thought carefully about how to respond. But the Famine Code had a philosophy embedded in it. So the philosophy was the philosophy of John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith and the political economists whose ideas had dominated British intellectual life for a generation. It held that free markets, even in crises, produced better outcomes than government intervention. It held that relief should be carefully calibrated to avoid disturbing normal commercial activity. It held that wages paid for relief work should always be set below the lowest wage available in the open market, to ensure that workers who could support themselves without relief were not tempted to take it. It held, in the final analysis, that the moral hazard of providing too much relief was greater than the moral hazard of providing too little. This philosophy had a name, too. It was called the non-interference doctrine, and under Curzon, and it hardened from a guideline into something closer to a sacred principle. The man who most directly shaped Curzon's thinking on famine was Sir John Strachey, a former lieutenant governor of the northwest provinces and finance member of the Viceroy's council. Strachey had written, in 1888, a book called India that laid out the economics of famine relief with calm, rational brutality. He argued that the greatest danger of famine relief was that it would accustom the Indian poor to depending on government support, undermining their self-reliance and distorting the labor market. He argued that the cost of relief had to be strictly controlled because an overly expensive famine response would damage the fiscal credibility of the Indian government and undermine the confidence of British investors. He argued, with the calm assurance of a man who had never missed a meal, that a certain level of famine mortality was simply the natural price of living in a country with India's climate and population density. Curzon read Strachey. Curzon agreed with Strachey, not because Curzon was stupid. He was not stupid, he was brilliantly intelligent, but because Strachey's framework gave intellectual respectability to something that Curzon was, by temperament and upbringing, already inclined to believe. That the suffering of the poor was, in the last analysis, not primarily a problem of governance. It was a problem of nature, of weather, of the unfortunate tendency of large populations to outrun their food supply. The government's job was not to prevent this suffering. It could not prevent it, but to manage it, to channel it, and to ensure that it did not destabilize the system of administration that made civilization possible. The suffering was abstract to him. That is the most honest way to say it. Not because Curzon lacked imagination. He had a vivid and cultivated imagination, as his travel writing amply demonstrates. But his imagination had been formed entirely within a set of social and physical boundaries that had never brought him into contact with the specific, concrete, irreducible experience of a person who is dying of hunger. He had read about it, he could describe it, he could, in the appropriate political context, express appropriate concern about it, but he had never felt it. He had never been in a room with it. He had never had to look at a specific face and make the direct, unmediated moral decision. This person is dying, and I have the power to stop it, and what am I going to do? His decisions were made at a desk in a marble building, surrounded by men who shared his education and his assumptions and his distance from the consequences of what they decided. The decisions were about numbers, about rates, about the relationship between relief expenditure and revenue projections. The people on the other end of those decisions were, in the administrative imaginary of the Viceroy's office, also numbers, population figures, mortality statistics, abstractions in a ledger, and Curzon was very, very good at managing abstractions in ledgers. There is a letter he wrote, in 1900, to the Secretary of State for India. The famine is at its height. He's writing about the cost of relief operations, so he describes the mortality figures. Hundreds of thousands of deaths acknowledged, the real number is certainly higher. And then he writes, without apparent irony, about the need to ensure that relief expenditure does not, quote, demoralize the Indian laboring population. He is worried about demoralization. He is worried that people who are dying might become accustomed to receiving government assistance and that this would be bad for them in the long run. The long run. There will be no long run for many of the people he is writing about. But George Curzon is a man who lives, who has always lived, at the level of systems and principles and the long-term trajectory of civilizations. He does not live at the level of Saraswati and her children. He could not. He had been shaped from his first breath in that marble hall, and to live somewhere else entirely. There is something else worth saying about Curzon, the man that goes beyond his class and his ideology. Something that his biographers acknowledge obliquely but rarely examine with full directness. Curzon was, by almost all accounts, a man almost entirely without self-doubt in his professional life. His personal life was different. He loved his first wife, Mary Leiter, with what appears to have been genuine and deep feeling, and her death in 1906, a year after he left India, devastated him in ways that briefly made him human to the people around him in a way that his official persona rarely allowed. But in his public professional self, in his role as administrator, as imperial statesman, as the man who ran things, doubt did not figure. And doubt, in a person with power over millions of lives, that is not a weakness. It is a moral necessity. The absence of doubt in Curzon's governance is everywhere in the record. When evidence came to him that his famine relief policies were producing inadequate outcomes, when collectors filed reports showing that people were dying in areas where relief was technically available, but practically inaccessible, his response was not to question the policy. It was to question the report, or to note that the local administration was applying the policy imperfectly, or to produce a more detailed set of guidelines that would ensure the policy was applied with greater precision. The policy was by definition correct. The shortcoming was always in the implementation. This is not unique to Curzon, and this is the characteristic intellectual failure of a certain kind of brilliance. The kind that is most comfortable when it can operate at the level of design rather than outcome, when it can produce a perfectly reasoned plan and treat the plan's failure as a problem of execution rather than conception. In a viceroy, in a man responsible for the lives of 300 million people, this failure of intellectual humility had consequences measured in bodies. He left India, in the end, more convinced than when he arrived that he had done great work there. His memoirs and letters from the period after his resignation are full of pride in his administrative achievements. The archaeological preservation, the police reform, the provincial reorganization. He mentions the famines, but briefly, and always in the context of his administration's response, rather than the scale of the catastrophe. He does not enumerate the dead. He does not sit with them. He moves on to the things he is proud of, and the things he is proud of are genuinely impressive, and he holds them in front of the things he is not proud of, and the dead stay behind the accomplishments, where they do not trouble the narrative of a great proconsul's great proconsulship. He was, to the end, a man who lived in the front rooms of his own legacy. Now let us go into the back rooms. Now let us follow the paperwork from his desk to the locked warehouse, to the body in the field. Now let us understand, in as much operational detail as the historical record permits, exactly how the machine worked, because understanding the machine is the whole point. The man is interesting. The machine is terrifying. There is a question that always comes up when we talk about mass death administered by bureaucracy. The question is, how does it actually work? How do you get a system? Thousands of individual human beings, each of them capable of moral reasoning, each of them presumably aware that people are dying, to function as an instrument of mass death without anyone pulling what we would recognize as a trigger. No death squads here, no orders to kill, just a machine turning and the bodies falling out the other end. The answer, when you look at the British Raj in famine, is carefully, methodically, with extraordinary attention to procedure. The Indian civil service was organized in a strict hierarchy. At the top sat the Viceroy, Curzon. Below him, the members of his council, finance, military, revenue, law. And below them, the provincial governors, the lieutenant governors and chief commissioners who administered the major regions of India. Below them, the commissioners who oversaw groups of districts. Below them, the collectors, the key figure at the operational level of British India, the man who sat at the center of each district and administered everything. Revenue collection, law enforcement, famine relief, census taking, road maintenance, the whole complex reality of governing a piece of a subcontinent. The collector was, in the imagination of the Indian civil service, something close to a Roman proconsul. He had extraordinary powers over his district, more direct personal authority than almost any governmental position in the modern British state. He was responsible for everything. He was supposed to know everything. He was, in theory, the living embodiment of the Raj's claim to benevolent governance, a single, capable, educated British officer who understood his district intimately and could make decisions in its best interest. In practice, the collector was a man receiving instructions from above and passing them down, constrained at every turn by rules that had been written in Calcutta or London by people who had never seen his district. He could recommend relief. He could escalate reports. He could, within very narrow limits, exercise discretion. But the fundamental decisions, whether to declare a famine, what grades of relief to provide, what the wage rate for relief works would be, whether to permit grain exports to be halted, whether to set maximum prices for grain, those decisions were made upstairs, and upstairs the philosophy was clear. So let us walk through what actually happened in a famine district under Curzon's administration. Let us walk through it the way you would if you were a collector receiving instructions in the monsoon-failed autumn of 1899. First, the assessment. When rains fail and crops begin to wither, you begin counting. You send your subordinate officers, the tahsildars, the patwaris, the local revenue men, into the fields to assess the damage. They count acreage, estimate yields, compare to normal. They file reports. You compile the reports. You send them up. This takes weeks. The reports travel by paper, by actual physical paper, moving through the postal system, from village to district, district to division, division to province, province to Calcutta. By the time Curzon has a clear picture of what is happening in a famine-struck district, it has been 3 months since the rains failed. 3 months of hunger before the system has even registered the extent of the problem. Second, the classification. The famine code required that a district go through specific stages: scarcity, distress, famine, before the highest level of relief was triggered. Each stage had specific criteria. The criteria were set by the government, not by the people dying. This meant that a district where people were actively starving might still be classified as distress rather than famine, because the mortality numbers hadn't crossed the threshold, or because the collector had exercised optimism in his assessment, or because the provincial governor was reluctant to trigger the expense of full famine relief, and had quietly communicated this reluctance downward through the hierarchy in ways that were never written down. The power to classify was the power to decide who lived and who died, and it sat with the British administration. Third, the relief works. This was the primary mechanism of famine relief under the Raj, not free food distribution, but paid labor on public works projects, roads, reservoirs, railway embankments. Starving people were given wages set deliberately below the market rate, to prevent those who were not starving from taking the work, in exchange for physical labor. You can see the logic if you tilt your head. It meant that relief was not charity, it was employment. It preserved the dignity of labor, and it added infrastructure to the empire. What it meant in practice was this: a person who had not eaten adequately for weeks, who was weakened by hunger and dehydration and the diseases that travel with malnutrition, was required to walk, sometimes many miles, to a relief camp and then perform heavy physical labor in order to earn enough to eat. If they were too weak to walk, or too sick, or too young, or too old, they did not qualify for the standard relief works and were instead directed to gratuitous relief, direct food distributions, which were funded at a fraction of the rate of the works programs and administered with considerably more suspicion. Let us be precise about those distances. The famine code specified that relief camps should be placed so that workers did not have to travel more than 10 miles to reach them, under 10 miles. For a person in the early stages of malnutrition, already weakened, already suffering from the borderline's dehydration that comes from a body rationing its own resources, 10 miles is not an administrative abstraction. It is an ordeal. For a person in the later stages of famine, a person whose muscle mass has been consumed by the body in the absence of dietary protein, whose immune system is already compromised, whose children may be too weak to be left alone, 10 miles is impossible. 10 miles is a death sentence disguised as a policy guideline. The physical examination at the camp gate was another barrier. Workers were assessed for their ability to perform hard labor. The standard was not whether they needed food. It was whether they could work hard enough to justify receiving it. And people who were too visibly wasted were sometimes turned away, the camp supervisor applying the admission criteria as written, because the criteria as written required workers to be capable of a day's hard labor on a road or reservoir project. The cruelest inversion in this system, the hungrier you were, the less likely you were to qualify for the food that might save you. The working day at a relief camp in famine Bengal ran from dawn until approximately 4 in the afternoon. Workers, men, women, some adolescents, carrying children who were too young to be left at home, moved earth, broke stone, dug channels, laid embankments. The supervisors measuring their output were district officers following the task rate set by the Famine Code, which specified exactly how much work entitled a worker to how much pay, which would then be exchanged for how much grain. The task rates had been designed to be achievable for a healthy laborer. For a malnourished one, they were often not achievable. Workers who fell short of their task received reduced wages. Reduced wages bought reduced grain. Reduced grain produced further malnutrition. The spiral had a direction, and it pointed down. The Famine Code specified, with meticulous precision, the caloric content of the ration to be provided. It was based on the analysis, performed in the 1870s, of what an average Indian laborer required to sustain heavy physical work. The analysis was not wrong exactly as an exercise in nutritional accounting, but it had been performed on healthy adults and applied without modification to populations that were already malnourished, already sick, already reduced by weeks or months of inadequate eating before the relief camps opened. The ration that would sustain a healthy person at hard labor was not the ration that would restore a starving person to health. The ration kept people alive, on the margins. Barely. And even then, even with the inadequate ration and the requirement of physical labor and the weeks of delay in classification, Curzon wanted it tighter. There is a circular he issued in 1900. And historians have quoted it for a century because it is so extraordinary in its clinical coldness, in which he lays out new guidelines for famine relief. He is concerned, he writes, about the scale of relief expenditure. He is concerned that too many people are being admitted to relief works, that the tests for admission are insufficiently rigorous. Yes, he wants stricter physical tests applied to people seeking relief. He wants the distance test, the requirement that workers travel a minimum distance to reach the relief camp, which functioned as an informal barrier to the weakest and most desperate, who could not walk far, maintained rather than relaxed. He wants the wage rate kept at its existing level, which he acknowledges is producing hardship, but which he believes is necessary to prevent abuse of relief. Abuse of relief. The phrase deserves a moment of attention. Curzon is worried that people who do not genuinely need help are claiming it. He is worried that the dying might be faking. And so he builds tests, barriers, distance requirements into a system already so attenuated that it is barely touching the scale of the catastrophe. Meanwhile, the grain is moving. Now, this is perhaps the most damning single fact about famine in British India, and it applies not just to Curzon, but to the entire century of British management. Famines in India did not occur because there was no food. They occurred because the food was somewhere else. The Raj's efficient, modern, admirably functional railway system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, moving agricultural surplus from producing regions to commercial centers and export ports. It moved this surplus with machine-like reliability regardless of local conditions. A district could be an official famine with its collector filing mortality reports, and that district's train station could simultaneously be loading grain cars bound for Calcutta or Bombay. This was not illegal. It was policy. The free movement of trade goods was, and the dominant economic philosophy of the period, not just permitted but required. To halt grain exports from a famine region would be to distort the market, to interfere with the natural price mechanism that, in theory, would eventually attract food back to the area by raising prices. The fact that prices in a famine region were rising faster than starving people could pay them was understood as a market imperfection, unfortunate, but not something that government should address through force. Curzon's Director General of Agriculture, a man named Sir Edward Buck, produced a report in 1902 analyzing the relationship between grain exports and famine mortality. The report was careful and thorough, as reports produced by the Indian Civil Service tended to be. It showed, in numbers that were hard to dispute, that the regions most severely affected by famine deaths were also the regions from which the most grain was being exported. Buck stopped short of recommending an export halt. He did not stop short because he had not seen the correlation. He stopped short because recommending an export halt would have required him to challenge an economic principle that was, at that time, as close to a religious truth as the secular British administration possessed. Buck filed the report. Curzon received it. An aide summarized it. A note was made about reviewing the famine code at some future point. The grain trains continued to run. Let us be specific about the numbers, because the numbers matter and they are not well known outside specialist historical literature. In 1901, the year the famine of 1899 to 1902 was at its worst, India exported approximately 32 million hundredweight of grain, wheat, rice, and other cereals, from its ports. This was not a dramatically different figure from the preceding years. The export machine ran through the famine with the steady, indifferent consistency of a mechanism doing precisely what it was designed to do. The ports of Bombay and Calcutta and Madras processed their regular volumes. The shipping companies received their regular cargoes. The shareholders in London and Glasgow and Manchester received their regular returns, and the children in Bankura continued dying. There is a way of looking at this that makes it seem like a simple moral failure, a choice to value money over lives, greed over humanity. And there was certainly greed in it, and in the sense that the economic interests being protected were real and substantial and served by a political system that gave them voice and weight. But the more interesting and more troubling explanation is not greed, it is ideology. It is the completely sincere belief, held by men of intelligence and education, that to halt grain exports in a famine would be not just economically harmful, but morally harmful. That it would set a precedent for government intervention in markets that would, in the long run, produce worse outcomes than the famine mortality it prevented. The moral logic of this position requires the deaths to be kept at a certain level of abstraction. If you are the man deciding whether to halt grain exports, and when the people whose deaths would be prevented by your decision are statistics in a mortality report, filed by a collector you have never met in a district you have never visited, then the calculus can, just barely, be made to work. The abstraction makes it possible. The distance makes it possible. The hierarchy makes it possible because the hierarchy ensures that no one person ever has to make the full decision. Each person makes only a piece of it, and the piece they make is always reasonable, always defensible, always grounded in policy and procedure. The Viceroy sets the policy. The finance member sets the budget. The lieutenant governor classifies the district. The commissioner allocates the relief camps. The collector applies the admission tests. The camp supervisor distributes the rations. Each person at each level is doing their job. Each person, if asked, can point to the policy document, the budget allocation, the procedural guideline. Each person can say, "I followed the rules. I did what was expected." No one person in this chain killed Saraswati's child, and yet she is dead. Let us talk about who was doing this. Because one of the temptations when we study systems of institutionalized death is to focus entirely on the man at the top, on Curzon, and to treat everyone below him as interchangeable parts in his machine. This is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that matters for understanding how these things happen. The Indian civil service was staffed by men who were, in many cases, aware of what was happening. The collector of a famine district knew what he was seeing. He was walking through the villages. He was receiving the mortality reports from his own subordinate officers. He was, sometimes, a man of genuine decency who was horrified by what he was witnessing and who wrote urgent, unambiguous dispatches to his provincial government begging for greater relief expenditure, for relaxed admission criteria, for more gratuitous relief for those too weak to work. Some of those dispatches were acted upon. Some were not. The ones that were not fell victim to a process that historians of bureaucracy have described with precision. The transformation as a message travels upward through a hierarchy, of emergency into routine. A collector's urgent report arrives at the commissioner's office. The commissioner is already managing reports from 7 other districts, each with its own urgencies. He synthesizes the situation, applies the existing guidelines, forwards a summary to the provincial government. The provincial government is aware of political pressure from London not to overspend. The lieutenant governor makes a judgment call. A note goes back down. Maintain current relief levels, apply tests rigorously, report back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks in a famine is a very long time. What is remarkable about the system is not that it contained cruel men. It did contain some cruel men, men who were contemptuous of Indian life and indifferent to Indian suffering in ways that go beyond policy and ideology into something closer to personal pathology. But the system did not require cruel men. The system required only obedient men. Men who followed the procedure. Men who trusted that the procedure had been designed by people wiser than themselves. Men who understood that their careers depended on not making large, expensive, politically inconvenient decisions without sanction from above. The system produced death through diligence, through the careful, faithful application of policy by men who were, in their private lives, often kind and conscientious and devoted to their families and generous to friends and capable of moral reasoning in every context except the professional one, where the professional context made the moral reasoning unnecessary because the procedure was the moral reasoning and the procedure said, do not give too much relief, do not spend too much money, do not distort the market, do not demoralize the laboring class. Follow the procedure. The procedure is civilization. The procedure is what we are here to administer. The bodies are an unfortunate byproduct. There is a document in the India Office records in London, the archives of the old India Office, now housed in the British Library. That is one of the more startling things you can find in a morning of historical research. It is a table, a simple, clean, bureaucratic table prepared by a revenue officer in Bengal in 1900. The table has columns: district name, population, estimated mortality, relief expenditure, revenue collected. Row after row after row of districts across Bengal, each with its numbers filled in with neat handwriting. The mortality column and the revenue column are both high. In district after district, the revenue column shows substantial sums collected, land tax, assessed and gathered, in the same years and often in the same months, where the mortality column shows substantial numbers of dead. And the men who collected the revenue were not, in most cases, the same men who administered the famine relief. The revenue system and the relief system were separate departments, operating according to their own procedures, their own timelines, their own metrics of success. The revenue system's metric of success was, did you collect what was assessed? The relief system's metric of success was, did you keep the relief expenditure within budget? Neither system's metric of success was, are people alive? This is not negligence. Please understand this clearly. This is not a system that had intended to keep people alive and failed. This is a system that had been designed with entirely different goals, and that was pursuing those goals with considerable success. And that was generating mass death as a side effect. A side effect that was visible to everyone with eyes, documented in the reports that flowed up through the hierarchy, and that was addressed with the level of concern appropriate to a side effect. Periodic reviews, procedural adjustments, expressions of regret, and no fundamental change. At the center of this machine sat George Curzon, reading everything, annotating everything, writing detailed instructions about everything, and directing his extraordinary administrative energy toward the things that interested him. The preservation of monuments, the reorganization of provincial boundaries, the preparation of the Delhi Durbar, the management of relations with the princely states, the correspondence with London about the implications of Russian expansion in Central Asia. And when the famine reports crossed his desk, as they did regularly, he read them with the same focused attention he brought to everything. He understood the numbers. He corrected grammatical errors in the subordinate reports, because Curzon always corrected grammatical errors. He issued guidelines. He set budgets. He maintained the policy framework he had inherited, tightened it in places where he thought it had become lax, and moved on. The machine kept turning. George Curzon left India in 1905. He did not leave triumphantly. He left in the aftermath of a political humiliation, a bitter dispute with Lord Kitchener, the commander of the Indian Army, over the question of whether the military should be subordinate to civilian authority. Curzon took the position of constitutional principle. The Kitchener took the position of institutional reality. The cabinet in London, tired of both of them, sided with Kitchener. Curzon resigned and sailed home, convinced, with some justice, that he had been betrayed by the government he had served brilliantly. He received a public farewell in Bombay that was, by most accounts, genuinely moving. Indians who had watched him govern for 6 years, not all of them, but some of them, some of those who had benefited from his administrative reforms and his genuine, if paternalistic, interest in Indian culture, were sorry to see him go. He left behind a Bengal that he had recently and catastrophically divided. The partition of Bengal in 1905 was, in some ways, the defining act of Curzon's political legacy in India. Not the famines, which were diffuse and hard to attribute cleanly, but the partition, which was Curzon's direct creation and whose consequences were felt for decades. His reasoning was, typically, administrative. Bengal was simply too large to govern efficiently. Split it into two. East Bengal and Assam under one administration, the rump Bengal with Bihar and Orissa under another. Straightforward, rational, efficient. What Curzon failed to understand, or chose not to understand, was that Bengal was not primarily a geographic and administrative unit. It was a civilization. It had a language, Bengali, shared across the whole region, one of the great literary traditions of the world. It had a culture of extraordinary richness, a Hindu-Muslim cultural intermingling that had produced everything from the poetry of Rabindranath Tagore to the architecture of Dhaka. It had an emerging nationalist movement, centered in Calcutta, that saw, correctly, the partition as a deliberate attempt to weaken Bengali political coherence by separating its Muslim majority east from its Hindu majority west. The response to the partition was the Swadeshi movement, the most significant mass political mobilization in Indian history up to that point. Bengali activists called for a boycott of British goods. They organized demonstrations, strikes, meetings. They sang songs and burned British cloth and passed around colored threads that symbolized the unity of Bengal. The movement spread beyond Bengal and became, effectively, the opening act of the independence movement that would eventually expel the British from India entirely. Curzon had provoked it with a bureaucratic reorganization. He would spend the rest of his life unable to understand why. So he returned to England and pursued the remainder of his political career with the same ferocious energy he had applied to everything, and with the same pattern of brilliant competence producing unexpected ruin. He was passed over for Prime Minister twice. In 1916 and again in 1923, when the Conservative Party chose the little-known Stanley Baldwin over Curzon, with a cruelty of timing that reportedly reduced him to tears. He served as Foreign Secretary under Lloyd George and achieved in the Lausanne Conference of 1923 a diplomatic settlement of the Turkish question that was, by technical standards, genuinely impressive. He died in 1925. He was 65 years old. His spine had given him trouble for decades, and it had finally, much in the form of a circulatory collapse caused by years of physical strain and the stress of his various humiliations, given out. He was buried in Kedleston, in the family church beside the marble hall where he had been born. His tomb is there still. Now let us talk about the dead, the famines of Curzon's viceroyalty, 1899 to 1902, with secondary events in 1905. Killed somewhere between 1 million and 4 million people, depending on whose numbers you accept, and the range is itself a verdict on how seriously the British administration tracked the human cost of its own policies. The number is uncertain because nobody made it a priority to count. Revenue collection was counted precisely. Mortality was estimated. The victims were overwhelmingly rural, overwhelmingly poor, and overwhelmingly from the lower agricultural castes and from the landless laboring class. The people who were closest to the margins of subsistence in good years and had no buffer when the margin disappeared. They died of starvation, but most of them did not die of starvation alone. They died of cholera, which moves through malnourished populations with efficient brutality. They died of dysentery, of typhoid, of smallpox. They died of the specific cocktail of disease and malnutrition that public health scholars now recognize as the signature of famine mortality. The immune system compromised by weeks of inadequate nutrition, the body unable to fight off infections that a healthy person would survive. The children died first, or they died alongside their parents. There were areas of Bengal and the central provinces and Rajputana where, as in the famine years, birth rates dropped to near zero while death rates climbed. In those places, The demographic record of the famine is visible in population pyramids that are missing an entire cohort. The children who were never born, the young adults who did not survive to reproduce. The shape of absence. Survivor accounts where they were recorded, and they were not widely recorded because the administrative machinery of the Raj was not designed to produce survivor accounts. Describe experiences that do not become less harrowing with repetition. The experience of watching a child die of hunger while grain stores sit locked nearby. The experience of the relief camp. The long walk. The physical examination. The daily ration that was never quite enough. The other dying people around you. The British officer keeping the count. And the experience of returning afterward to a village that had lost a third of its population, to fields that had been left untended because there were not enough people to tend them, to a social fabric torn in ways that took generations to repair. These survivors were not, in most cases, remembered by name. The administrative record of the Raj preserves them as numbers in mortality tables. Saraswati does not appear in the archives. Her child has no record. They existed and suffered and died, entirely outside the framework of official memory that the empire maintained for its own history. This is part of the legacy. There is another part, and it is harder to look at, because it requires us to think about what the famines of British India mean for our understanding of empire as an institution. Not just as a historical phenomenon, but as a way of organizing political authority and distributing economic resources. The standard British defense of the Raj, the defense that Curzon himself would have offered and that many British historians offered for much of the 20th century, was that the famines were natural disasters made worse by India's poverty and population density, and the limits of 19th century agricultural technology and transport. The British, on this view, were doing their best in difficult circumstances. They built railways and telegraph lines and installed administrative systems that, for all their imperfections, represented a genuine improvement over what had existed before. The deaths were terrible, but they were, in the last analysis, the deaths that nature produced, and the Raj reduced them as much as it reasonably could. Note, the problem with this defense is the data. Mike Davis, the historian, spent much of his career documenting what he calls late Victorian holocausts, the famines of the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s across India, China, and Brazil. What Davis found, and what subsequent scholarship has largely confirmed, is that famine mortality in India increased dramatically during the period of British colonial rule, not despite British governance, but in some meaningful causal relationship with it. The specific mechanisms are debated. How much was the land revenue system? How much was the shift to cash crops? How much was the dismantling of local grain storage and food security systems? How much was the rigid application of free market ideology in crisis conditions? Historians argue about the relative weight of these factors. What they do not, any longer, nay seriously argue, is that the British Raj was an innocent bystander to its own famines. The empire extracted. That is the simple, unavoidable fact at the center of all the complexity. It extracted agricultural surplus from India and sent it elsewhere. It extracted labor value from Indian workers and paid them at rates set by the government of a foreign country. It extracted revenue from Indian landholders and used it to fund a military force that protected, primarily, the interests of the extracting power. And when the natural variability of the Indian monsoon disrupted agricultural production, as it always had and always would, the people who had been extracted down to the margins had no margins left. The famines were not nature. The famines were the meeting point between nature's variability and human-made vulnerability. And the vulnerability was British-made. What does this mean for Curzon? This is where the moral philosophy of the thing gets genuinely difficult, and where I want to resist the temptation to give you a clean answer, because there isn't one. George Curzon did not create the land revenue system. He did not design the famine code. He did not invent the economic ideology that governed British India's response to crisis. He inherited all of these things, as his predecessors had inherited them, as his successors would inherit them, as the whole apparatus of empire was inherited and passed down and refined. He was not a monster. He was an excellent specimen of his class and his time and his education, which is exactly the problem. And what Curzon did was this. He ran the machine at full efficiency without ever seriously questioning whether the machine should run. He tightened the relief criteria when he thought they had become slack. He maintained grain exports in famine conditions. He wrote letters about the risk of demoralizing the poor while the poor were dying. He never, in any document that historians have found, sat with the specific, concrete human consequences of his policies and asked himself whether the policies needed to change. He never, in any speech or letter or diary entry, seems to have been troubled by the weight of the deaths for which his administration bore at minimum partial responsibility. This is not the same as wanting people to die. I believe that. George Curzon did not want people to die. But there is a category of responsibility that exists below intention, below the level of what we want or plan. There is the responsibility that comes from power, from sitting at the center of a system with the ability to change it and choosing not to. There is the responsibility that comes from ideology, from treating an economic theory as a natural law and refusing to test it against the evidence of the bodies it produces. And there is, perhaps most importantly for those of us living in the present, the responsibility that comes from certainty. From the bone-deep, marrow-deep certainty that the way you understand the world is correct, that the suffering you see is the price of progress, that your civilization is the highest form of governance humanity has yet achieved, and that to question it is to invite chaos. George Curzon was certain. He was certain in the way that people are certain when their certainty has never been seriously challenged, when the world has arranged itself from their earliest days in a marble hall to confirm their assumptions. And his certainty was what made him useful to the empire, and what made the empire deadly through him. The British Empire, in its Indian phase, is now remembered, in India, where it is remembered honestly, as a period of extraction, of exploitation, of deliberate and sometimes criminal misuse of power. The famines are part of this memory. Curzon is part of this memory. There is no commemorative statue of Lord Curzon in Calcutta, the city where he governed. There is no fondly remembered Curzon Street in the Indian government quarter. His Delhi Durbar, which he organized with such elaborate care, is remembered now primarily as an image of the strangeness of empire. A British earl staging a Mughal pageant in a conquered capital to celebrate a king who had never visited. In Britain, the memory is more complicated and more comfortable. Curzon is remembered in the Foreign Office, which he served. He's remembered in the history of British conservatism as a brilliant man undone by his own personality. He's remembered in the preservation of India's historical monuments, which he genuinely cared for, and which stand today because of his efforts. He is not primarily remembered in connection with the famines that killed millions during his tenure. That memory has not been fully absorbed. Perhaps it is beginning to be. Shashi Tharoor's book Inglorious Empire, published in 2017, brought the economic history of British India to a wide audience, including the famine mortality statistics, including the export data, including the structural analysis that connects British policy to Indian deaths. It sparked a genuine debate in Britain about what the empire actually was and what obligations, if any, the present owes the past. This debate is incomplete. It will remain incomplete for a long time. The scale of what happened in British India, the 2 centuries of extraction, the dozens of famines, the tens of millions of dead, is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. It challenges a self-image. It requires sitting with discomfort that is, for most British people, genuinely new. The comfortable story, Britain civilized India, built the railways, gave it the rule of law, is not entirely false. It is incomplete in a way that a missing death toll of somewhere between 12 and 30 million people makes catastrophic. What do we do with Curzon, then? What do we do with the man who sat at the desk in the marble building in Calcutta and wrote his careful letters about administrative efficiency, while the machine he was running processed millions of human beings into revenue statistics and mortality tables? I think we do this. We resist the urge to explain him away in either direction. We resist the urge to make him a monster, because monsters are an excuse. They let us treat mass death as an anomaly, the work of extraordinary evil, something that normal people could not produce. And we resist the urge to excuse him as a man of his time, because that phrase is one of the most persistent lies in the language of historical sympathy. There were men of his time who saw what the empire was doing and said so. There were voices, Indian voices primarily, but also British ones, that described the structural relationship between colonial extraction and famine mortality in terms that Curzon could have understood if he had chosen to. He did not choose to. He chose instead the machine. And the machine, as machines do when they are operated by the right person, ran beautifully. It ran so beautifully that its outputs, the revenue figures, the infrastructure statistics, the military readiness reports, looked to the people who read them in London and Calcutta like success. The mortality statistics, filed in separate columns, in separate reports, by separate departments, did not look like anything. They looked like numbers. They looked like the price of civilization in a difficult climate. They were, as it turns out, the price of civilization in a marble hall. Saraswati's child has no name in the archive. Her district collector has a name. Her commissioner has a name. The lieutenant governor of Bengal has a name, and his successor in the finance member who set the relief budget, and the secretary of state who approved it, and the viceroy who shaped it with his precise, relentless, brilliant administrative hand. The child has no name. Remember that. Because somewhere, in every functioning empire, in every system that runs so efficiently that its outputs look like success and its side effects look like numbers, there is someone who has no name. Someone who is, from the perspective of the machine, a variable, a statistic, a drain on the relief budget, a figure in a mortality table to be reviewed in 6 months' time, when the monsoon question has been resolved and the revenue projections have been finalized. We study these empires. We study the men who ran them. We study the machines they built and operated with such extraordinary competence, and we do it not to feel superior to the past. That is too easy, too comfortable, and almost certainly unearned. We do it to understand how it is possible for a person to be brilliant and educated and capable of moral reasoning and still produce this. We do it to look at the machines around us, the ones running so efficiently that their outputs look like progress, and to ask, what is falling out the other end? There is a broader question that Curzon's story forces into view, and it is one that we are still, in the present moment, sound very far from answering satisfactorily. The question is this: what is governance for? This sounds like a philosophy seminar question. It is not. It is a practical question, the most practical question, the question that George Curzon answered with the wrong answer, and that the Raj answered with the wrong answer for 150 years, and that the millions of people who died of preventable famines in 19th century India paid for with their lives. The Raj answered the question like this: governance is for order, for efficiency, for the maintenance of a system of administration that produces predictable outputs, revenue, security, infrastructure, legal adjudication, and that remains stable and functional regardless of external conditions. Governance is for the machine. The machine is civilization, so civilization justifies the cost. There is another answer to the question. It goes like this: governance is for people. Its legitimacy derives entirely from its relationship to the welfare of the people it governs. An administration that maintains perfect bureaucratic efficiency while its population starves is not a good administration that has encountered an unfortunate problem. It is a failed administration by the only measure that ultimately matters. The British Raj in the age of Curzon would have found this second answer naive, sentimental, the kind of thing said by people who did not understand how systems worked or what it took to run a country the size of India. And from inside the worldview that produced the Raj, that response was coherent, it was consistent, it was internally logical. It was, using the language of rational governance, defensible. It was also catastrophically, irredeemably wrong. And the people who paid the price of its wrongness were people who had no voice in the system, no representation in its structures, no mechanism for making the people in power accountable to them. They were subjects, not citizens. They were governed, not represented. They were, in the architecture of imperial administration, the raw material from which the machine extracted its outputs. Not the people the machine existed to serve, but the resource the machine existed to process. This is what colonial governance was. Underneath all the rhetoric about civilization and uplift and the white man's burden, underneath all the genuine belief in those ideas held by many of the men who administered it, this is what it was a machine for processing human beings as resources. And the most dangerous part of this machine was not the cruelty in it. It was the competence. Because cruelty attracts resistance. Cruelty generates opposition. Cruelty makes its victims visible to any observer with a conscience. But competence has a way of justifying itself. Competence produces the railway timetable and the well-swept parade ground and the carefully audited ledger and the efficiently organized relief camp. And these things look, to the people producing them, like evidence of good governance. They look like achievement. They look like the proof that the machine is working. The bodies in the fields do not look like failure to the man who runs a competent machine. They look like an unfortunate externality. They look like the price paid for something worthwhile. They look, out in the final accounting, like a number in a column. Regrettable, but contained. And anyway, the mortality rate was lower than during the famine of 1877, so the trend is improving. So the machine is working, so the work continues. George Curzon went home. He pursued his career. He sought the prime ministership and did not receive it. He served as foreign secretary and achieved some genuine diplomatic successes. He died with his spine finally giving out and his ambitions still not fully satisfied, and was buried in Derbyshire with his family, under marble, in the church beside the hall where he was born. He had ruled over, during his 6 years as Viceroy, the largest population ever governed by a single human being in the history of the world. He had done so with extraordinary competence, leaving behind administrative reforms that shaped Indian governance for decades. He had also presided over the deaths of somewhere between 1 and 4 million people in famines that his policies exacerbated and his ideology prevented him from adequately addressing. Both of these things are true. Both of them are him. This is the hardest lesson of Curzon's story, and the most important one for the present. The lesson is not that brilliant people are dangerous, though they can be. The lesson is not that ideology is dangerous, though it always is when it is treated as certainty. The lesson is simpler and harder than either of those things. The lesson is that a person can do great work and terrible harm simultaneously, in the same administration with the same hands, from the same desk. That the achievements do not cancel the deaths, and the deaths do not erase the achievements, and that holding both of these things in your mind at once, without resolving them into a simpler verdict, is the only honest way to reckon with what empires actually were, and what the people who ran them actually did. We are not finished with that reckoning. Britain is not finished with it. India is not finished with it. The world that was built by the great empires of the 19th century is still the world we inhabit, its structures and its inequalities and its geographies of wealth and poverty still bearing the shape of the decisions made at those desks, in those marble buildings, by those meticulous, brilliant, certain men. The reckoning is still in progress. And somewhere in it, unnamed, is Saraswati's child. That is where this story ends. That is where it has to end. Not with Curzon's biography or his political legacy or the historiographical debate about how to weigh his achievements against his failures. Not with the economic analysis or the mortality statistics or the structural critique of colonial extractivism. With the specific, irreducible, unanswerable fact of a death that did not have to happen, in a country that had the grain to prevent it, administered by an empire that chose not to. Everything else is context. The death is the thing. Remember it.